Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. Recording this on Tuesday. It's about 6:50. You're going to hear from Lance Reisland a little bit later. He's going to go over some of the Browns coaching candidates. But right now, it's me, Dan Labbe, Mary Kay Cabot, Ashley Bastock with you. And surprise, Zach Taylor is the longest tenured coach in the AFC North as we're sitting here recording this. Mary Kay, it's surprising, but it's not surprising. Like watching that game Monday night, it felt very final in a lot of ways, obviously with Aaron Rodgers, just kind of knowing the angst that was building around Mike Tomlin. There were fire Mike Tomlin chants earlier this season in Pittsburgh. And, they make the playoffs because the Ravens miss a kick, but still 19 years in, Mike Tomlin has essentially an exit meeting of some sort today and says, I'm done. I'm going to step away. So he is no longer the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So no matter how surprised anyone is or isn't, this is a pretty seismic moment in the NFL and the AFC North for the Cleveland Browns. This was, I still kind of trying to put my head around the idea that Mike Tomlin's not going to be on the sideline next season for Pittsburgh.
I know it is absolutely mind-blowing to think that both John Harbaugh and Mike Tomlin are gone from the AFC North, or at least gone from their respective teams. Who knows? I was thinking earlier today, why don't we just put Kevin Stefanski over in Baltimore? Then we can put John Harbaugh in Pittsburgh and Mike Tomlin in Cleveland. I mean, just do like a little musical chairs thing, right? But it is mind-blowing. In fact, Dan, you're celebrating your anniversary this week of being with cleveland.com.
I outlasted Mike.
And you don't know an AFC North without John Harbaugh and Mike Tomlin, right? Or barely.
Barely, yeah, barely.
Because this is your 20th anniversary. So John was 18 years, Mike was 19. And it is so bizarre to think that those guys are gone. It's even a weird feeling to me that Kevin's gone because I wasn't used to having a coach around for 6 years either, right? I mean, you barely get to know a guy and he was out the door in 1 or 2 years most of the time. So this is absolutely unbelievable to think that this is how this is all going down. And it really is a time of transition in the AFC North, obviously. And I think it's an opportunity. I really think it's an opportunity for the Browns to seize the moment. It was hard to get past Mike Tomlin. It was hard to get past John Harbaugh and the way those teams were coached. And Mike Tomlin never had a losing season. I mean, think about that. So I think it is an opportunity for the Browns to get the two things right that they have to get right. Now, we don't know for sure they're going to be able to get the quarterback right this coming year, but they have to get the coach right, and then they have to work towards getting the quarterback right as soon as they can. So this is a pivotal moment in Cleveland Browns history and in the AFC North. It's a changing of the guard, and it's finally a chance for the Cleveland Browns to return to respectability in this division and get out from underneath Harbaugh, Tomlin, and their dominance over Cleveland.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange to think about what this looks like without those two guys. And when I think about Mike Tomlin, obviously comes in and wins the Super Bowl in Pittsburgh. You could argue that they had it's sort of similar to what Baltimore's done recently, right? They had those great teams with great records, and then they came up short in the playoffs. And then the more I've thought about it, Ashley, I feel like Mike Tomlin has almost overachieved in the last few years when you kind of look at his quarterback situations. And I'm thinking about that roster, like the way it's constructed. That is not a good roster this year. That offense, like when we watched that offense without DK Metcalf go against the Browns a few weeks ago, it was like they had nothing. And so in a lot of ways, I think there's fair criticisms about Mike Tomlin and some of the lack of playoff success, but like the fact that they were even in that discussion these last few years when you've got Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers and Kenny Pickett as your quarterbacks, and the roster is getting older. I think he's actually, the more I think about it, the more I think maybe he actually overachieved in recent years.
Yeah, it's crazy because I came on the beat in 2021. My first game was the 2021 Halloween weekend game against the Steelers that I covered. And I say that because like the whole time I've been covering the Browns, that has been the Steelers' situation. Like, that first year on the beat was Big Ben's last year. He could not throw a ball further than 10 yards. Like, it was very evident. And the fact that I think back to all those years and, like, yes, the Browns have stolen a handful of games against them in years when they weren't so good, like last or 2024 in the snow game. And then this past year, obviously, in the second to last week of the season, they get a win against the Steelers. So they'd have some weird losses like that. But the fact that Mike Tomlin was able to figure out ways to win football games, even though in any of those years, they themselves do not have the quarterback, right? Like, we know about not having quarterbacks here in Cleveland, but really the Steelers haven't had a quarterback these last 6 or so years either, even in Ben Roethlisberger's last year when they knew it was coming and stuff. So it's been fascinating to watch him and them navigate that. And I think, like, for as frustrated as Steelers fans would get with Mike Tomlin and get with either the starting fast, finishing slow, or starting slow, finishing fast, and then losing in the wild card round the last however many years it's been, it is still success that the Browns have not managed to figure out when they themselves have not had the quarterback. But that's why we talk about, like, you don't have to tank to eventually win football games. Like, there are ways to do it. And for so many years, the Ravens and the Steelers have been the examples of that.
Yeah, and I think, for Pittsburgh, they just were never able to, they kind of got stuck in the middle, and they were just never able to get out of the middle. The Ravens sort of figured out their way. Part of that was getting Lamar Jackson in the building. Like, the Ravens just prepared a little better at quarterback, I think. They decided to take Lamar with that last pick, with their last pick in that first round that year. And, they end up transitioning to him, and now they go, so they go from Joe Flacco to Lamar Jackson, and the Steelers could never quite get that part of it figured out. But Mary Kay, I think a big piece of this is just the culture piece of it, and just losing, obviously Mike Tomlin was not a modern coach in a lot of ways, didn't go for it on fourth down very much, didn't embrace a lot of modern things that we're seeing now, but just you talk to his players, or you hear his players talk about him, or you hear previous players who have talked about him, former players, and it's like they will go to battle for Mike Tomlin every day of the week. You can't say anything bad about the guy. And I think losing that culture piece of him kind of running that organization and being that organization, I think that's all part of this idea that, even though Baltimore is still this super talented team, even though Pittsburgh, I think, can figure some things out and still be, a team on the cusp of the playoffs next year, it's part of why this thing is so wide open, because you've lost two just huge culture setters in Mike Tomlin and John Harbaugh.
Right. To have the kind of success that those guys have had over all of these years, you know that they are doing something right in the coaching realm. That doesn't just come from the talent that you have on the team. It doesn't just come from a well-run organization. You have to have the command of the locker room. You have to have a handle on the whole entire process. And so those guys did an amazing job with their teams. And for Mike to never have a losing season, that's remarkable. I always point to the Steelers and I say, why do the Browns always feel like they have to end up losing 14 games or 13 games or 11 games to get right? You don't have to do that. The Steelers never do that. So, or at least they haven't done it under Mike Tomlin. So those guys are icons. They're legends in those jobs. And it really is going to be so bizarre to see this new world order in the AFC North. I mean, I just can't even imagine it. And I have to wonder, are any of these guys still going to be in the AFC North? Is Kevin going to get one of these jobs? Is John going to get one of these jobs? I think Mike Tomlin is supposedly going to take a year off and do TV for a year, is what I'm hearing.
And I guess the Steelers, because he stepped down, the Steelers still have his rights too.
Right.
So that's
Yes.
another wrinkle in this as well.
Right. So he could end up going and doing TV for a year and then getting traded to another team after that. So they must have worked out some kind of an arrangement or an agreement that they parted ways somewhat amicably in this fashion, because that's how you would treat Mike Tomlin after everything that he's done for that organization. And then you hear over there in Baltimore, Steve Bisciotti just basically kind of telling it like it is about even if John Harbaugh had won the playoff game, how long would he have been the coach? He said a week. So they were parting ways no matter what. It was time for a change. Sometimes it becomes that. Sometimes it's just time for a new voice, a new face. And I think that's what happened in Cleveland too. I really do. I think that they just felt that it was time for a new energy in that chair, a new voice, a new face. And so everything is different. Everything is different now. But I do think that it really represents a chance for the Cleveland Browns to seize the moment. They already have right now the best defense in the AFC North. And now, if they can get it right on the other side of the ball, they might be able to make some noise in this division over the next how many every years. But they have to get the quarterback, of course.
Yeah, and I think we saw this year too, especially how bad this division got so quickly. And again, a part of that was, part of that was Baltimore was dealing with injuries. Lamar Jackson never quite looked like Lamar Jackson after that initial injury. I still think that's the team. But to Mary Kay's point, Ashley, like this Pittsburgh roster is not great, and they were bad on defense this year. Ravens were bad on defense this year. The Bengals, who knows, right? Can they protect Joe Burrow? Can they keep him upright? Do you trust Zach Taylor? Again, even though he's now the longest tenured AFC North coach somehow. There's so many questions across this division that it does speak to, this isn't a division where you have to be a juggernaut to win anymore. Like it's more wide open than it's ever been.
And the Bengals, also bad on defense. You forgot to mention
the Bengals awful. Probably the worst of everyone on defense.
Yes, they were the worst ones this year. So it is fascinating, right? Because I come back to that Wyatt Teller presser we had, not the last one when we talked to Wyatt, but it was, the second one of these three. We talked to him pre-trade deadline, then again at the very end of the year. And Wyatt had this quote about it being so disappointing how many close situations the Browns were in this year, because with 7 wins, you would have been in the mix for most of the year. And with 10 wins, you would have won the whole thing. So it's been trending that way really the last 2 years. I think in 2023, this was probably the best division in football the last 2 years, not so much for a variety of reasons. I think really a combination of aging rosters and injuries in a lot of cases. But it does kind of, once again, just serve as that reminder of it's important to get right the things Mary Kay's talking about, the coach and the quarterback, because there's so much unknown now. And you're the only team with a really good defense. And I think that's what makes the Browns interesting, even though there's 9 teams with head coach openings right now. You look at that list, and the Browns are the only team on the list with a really, really elite defense and a really, really elite that part of their roster. So it is, I think, in theory, a more attractive job than people are giving it credit for, even though I think for most head coaching candidates, the quarterback situation is going to be the number one thing. But I don't know, maybe there's some appeal there to someone in terms of, hey, you're going to have some say and input in all this and helping solve this, even though we don't have the guy right now. But I mean, overall, this division, so much is up in the air, but the Browns at least can say they are the one team that has a good defense of the 4.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple. There's kind of a couple lessons in this. I think for first of all, on the coaching side, just who Mike Tomlin was when he got this Pittsburgh job. He was a guy in his 30s. He was a surprise hire. If I remember right, and again, it was a very different time. So maybe we just weren't aware of as many candidates as we are today. But he wasn't going into that cycle as you got to go hire Mike Tomlin. He had been a defensive coordinator for a year in Minnesota, actually Kevin's first year in Minnesota. And the Steelers ended up hiring him, and look where it got him. And I also think another kind of lesson there is, to the point where the Steelers never tanked, when they had an opportunity, when they did have kind of a down year and they drafted Ben Roethlisberger, that just changed their entire franchise. So you've got to be ready to take advantage of that. The Browns, of course, last year didn't take a quarterback high. They decided to trade down. Maybe there wasn't a guy. I don't know. This year they're going to be sitting at 6-24. Maybe there's going to be an opportunity for them to make a move to get a quarterback. I don't know what this class is going to ultimately look like. But I think there's lessons in there, Mary Kay, of this idea of like, you do have this opportunity to find the right coach, even if it's somebody that nobody expects. And you also still have this golden opportunity to maybe figure out this quarterback situation. And again, I don't know how you do that, but this is, you can't win 2 or 3 games again. You can't tank for Arch Manning again. I don't know if they can survive that. So like, you got to get that quarterback position figured out. And that's kind of what you've been hitting at over and over here again, is like, get head coach, get quarterback, and the rest can fall into place. And who knows, maybe 19 years from now, we'll still be talking about the same guy running the Cleveland Browns.
Right? I mean, could you imagine that? That's the thing. When you look at the Ravens and the Steelers, for the most part, they have had stability at those positions. John Harbaugh had Joe Flacco and Lamar Jackson. So they had their head coach for 18 years, and they had their first quarterback for a long stretch of that. And then he had his second quarterback for another long stretch. And that's the thing that has been missing, is that continuity and stability. Now, the Steelers, they've had the continuity at head coach, and with Ben Roethlisberger, they had the continuity at quarterback. And obviously, they've struggled since then to find that replacement for Ben and to get back to that place. So they're finding out the hard way too, that if you don't hit on that quarterback, and they didn't hit on Kenny Pickett, maybe they would have hit on Malik Willis. They had a chance to pick Malik Willis in 2022. Now, it would have taken development. It would have taken time. It would have taken care. It would have taken everything that the Baltimore Ravens did with Lamar Jackson. Like, you really have to commit to the bit, right? And it would have been a completely different thing for them. But if you get the right people in place, I think they could have made that work. And I thought they would do that. I really did. But I think there was some sentiment where Kenny had gone to Pitt, and it just sort of felt like the right thing to do at the time. But, they may have messed that one up. But I suppose they could fix it, because Malik Willis is a free agent. So you never know. But anyways, so that's what the Browns have got to find. They need to find their head coach. They need to show that they are an organization that can nail it at head coach, like the Steelers have and like the Ravens have. And then you can have your decade-long head coach or whatever it is. I know they felt like they had that with Kevin Stefanski, and they may have had that with Kevin Stefanski, but then you obviously have to supply that coach with the quarterback. You have to supply him with the quarterback, because John Harbaugh wouldn't have been John Harbaugh without Joe Flacco in his prime and without Lamar Jackson. And Mike Tomlin may not have been Mike Tomlin without Ben Roethlisberger all of those years. And somehow he kept winning even after that. But it really helps to be able to obviously find that quarterback. And once again, I don't know that this is going to be another one of those years where you can easily find a quarterback. I just don't know where that quarterback is going to come from, even for the Cleveland Browns, if they decide that Shedeur Sanders is not the answer for the early part of the season. Because I maintain they have to get to winning. You got to get to winning. You have to start out strong. You have to hit the ground running. This is not a developmental year. You can't be doing that. Nobody has the stomach for that. And maybe he is that guy. Maybe if you give him what he needs and you rebuild the line and you give him a bunch of weapons, maybe he can go out there and win for you right away. Maybe he can do that. I'd be very interested to hear what all of these coach candidates are saying about that situation and what the Browns are hearing about their quarterback situation. It would be very, very interesting. And I'm sure as we go through time over the next couple months, we will hear things about that. Things start to come out at the Combine and the Senior Bowl and different places like that. And you do get, some insight into what people are thinking about this situation, this quarterback situation, this job, whatnot. But that's what they have to do. They have to seize the moment, and they first have to get their coach, and then they've got to figure out their quarterback.
Yeah, and then that's a hard play to land because, I mentioned this with Lance in the second part, like, for a guy like a Grant Udinski, who might be like a genius, he might be a prodigy. The Browns might look at him and say, "Yeah, he's our guy," but is he gonna look at it and say, "Well, you know what? I'm 30 years old. I've only been a coordinator for a year. Maybe I don't wanna risk it and go there to a place that has kinda killed coaches' careers. Maybe I'm okay being coordinator for another year or 2 and kind of doing a Ben Johnson and waiting to see if something else comes along, after I've gained a little more experience and, someplace where maybe I like the quarterback situation a little better." So, I would imagine, Ashley, that, all of these guys are looking at this, trying to figure out exactly what the Browns are planning to do at quarterback. Like, you know, Mike McDaniel is probably sitting there saying, like, "Yeah, okay, so who's my quarterback? Give me the plan here. Tell me what you're going to do." And so they've got to sort of figure out, this is how we're going to get you in our building as our coach, and then also, here's how we're going to execute this plan we laid out for you at quarterback. And hopefully it'll go better than whatever plan they laid out for Myles Garrett last year when they got him to sign that extension.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bad hiring cycle, I think, to not have that quarterback given the other teams in place. Now there are other teams with questions at quarterback, but you have to look at the Browns and where things stand right now and wonder if it is the worst because, like, okay, the Raiders were a disaster, right? But the Raiders are in position to immediately draft that guy with the number 1 overall pick. You're looking at a draft where there's probably only 3 guys and you have the number 6 overall pick. So they have decent capital to play around with and try and solve that situation, but it still isn't a perfect situation in that way. So I'm fascinated. And again, I mean, knowing that they're going to have input, right? Andrew Berry said that. Obviously, I'm sure that's something they're talking about in these interviews. Is that going to be alluring, or is it what you're saying, Dan, going to scare potential candidates off and being like, well, look at the history of the Cleveland Browns and how well that's worked out for other people. Like, I don't want to get caught up in it. So it's fascinating. And like I said, it's also a bad year to not need a defensive head coach. And we know they've said they're not going to discriminate. And I think, as we've talked about, there's plenty of examples throughout the AFC of you can have a successful defensive focused or a head coach with a defensive background. But I mean, it doesn't change the fact the Browns really, really need somebody to fix this offense and help them fix this quarterback problem.
Well, it's just going to be weird next year. The first time the Browns play the Steelers, whenever that is, and it's not Mike Tomlin marching up and down the sideline, and it's just a strange day here in the NFL and the AFC North. And again, for a guy that has had a lot of success against the Cleveland Browns over his career, certainly stepping down as the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. All right, we're going to take a break on the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. When we come back, Lance Reisland is going to join us, and he's going to give us some of his scouting reports on some of these Browns coaching candidates. Welcome back to the Orange and Brown Talk podcast, and we welcome on now Lance Reisland because it is Tuesday. Lance, I wasn't sure if we'd have you on this week, but you've sent us so much info about these coaching candidates, and I wanted to kind of pick your brain on sort of where things stand right now with the Browns and the coaches. So welcome back here on our normal Tuesday.
Absolutely, thanks for having me, my friend.
All right, let's get to it.
We're right into it. Right back into it. It doesn't no rest. Let's go.
No off season. That's for sure. So I wanted to spend a little time with you. We talked before we started recording here. I wanted to ask you about maybe some of the younger guys or some of the names that maybe people haven't talked about a lot. Obviously, everybody knows the Harbaughs, the McDaniels, now Mike Tomlin. Obviously, I don't know if he would be a candidate or not, but I want to get into some of the other guys, and I want to start with someone who sort of is flying under the radar, but also it would not surprise me if he got this job. And that is Dan Pitcher. Works in Cincinnati, is their offensive coordinator. And, that's always a weird role with Zach Taylor. I know they've always been a little nebulous over the years of who's calling plays and who's not, like even when Brian Callahan was there. But tell us a little bit about Dan Pitcher and maybe what he would bring to the Browns.
Well, he's a guy that's going to, when you look at his resume, everybody, when you look at a resume, everybody has something that stands out. And for him, it would be Joe Burrow. It would be Joe Burrow as a rookie. He kind of really handled Joe Burrow's footwork in the pocket. When Joe Burrow came out, he was really good, but he had some footwork stuff needed worked on and some fundamental stuff. And pitcher did a great job with that. The other thing with Zach Taylor is that Zach Taylor, obviously, if you're working together, it's an 11 personnel. So the philosophy behind it, and you and I have talked about it, like when the Browns, that's why the Browns match up really well with these guys, is because they like to get 5 out in the pass route. They like to use the extended run game almost as a run game. The run game is really simple. They'll run some zone, but not much else. They don't pull very many guys, excuse me, but they're really an 11 personnel. Now, they have the personnel there to do that. And as I've stated to people, we're only good coordinators when we have good players. And that's for everybody at every level. So what really worked was 11 personnel because they had all those guys over the last, 6-7 years. They've obviously had Chase and Higgins, but they, Yoshi Voss and the guys they've had in the past too, they have been really good. So he's going to bring over 11 personnel. The run game will be very simple. If you think about it, I don't want to say finesse because it's not a finesse game, but it's not the 13, 12 personnel that the Browns fans have been used to. This is a spread it horizontally, spread it vertically, take your shots on first down, simple run game to try to keep the box numbers what you want, but not real complex run game. This is a pass first kind of guy. And, obviously with, being young, he's 38 years old, he's got some experience, but the big thing about him is that what he's going to bring to the pass game and what he would do for the quarterbacks of the Browns.
Yeah, and it's interesting too when you talk about sort of the personnel. If he did actually want to run maybe that more open system, the Browns would have to make some adjustments to who they have, but they're also in a position where Andrew Berry has said, they're going to focus on the offense this offseason, right? So you got the O-line. They would probably need to add some stuff at receiver. You're probably moving on from David Njoku, so that kind of opens up Harold Fannin to just sort of be that tight end one. And you can fill in the blanks at some of those other tight end positions if you're going to be playing more 11 personnel. So it would be interesting to see sort of how the Browns built this thing this offseason if they went that direction.
Well, yeah, so if you take a guy for example, what would that mean? Well, that changes. Say they go with receiver first pick. If they go with pitcher, then you're probably going to go with maybe like a Makai Lemon, right? Because you need a guy who can create space. You need a slot receiver in 11 personnel. Whereas if you go with another coordinator or a defensive guy, maybe they go Carnell Tate because they want a vertical guy who's good at the catch point. So it kind of depends on what you're going to do, how many receivers you're going to have in the game, and not only the routes, but when I say extended run game, that means a lot of, Taylor considers hitches and slants and bubbles. Those are all extended run games. So literally they might throw the ball 50 times, but on his chart, they only threw it 34 times because 16 of those were quick bubble screens and things like that. So guys like that, when I had even at the high school level, when you have a good quarterback, you're not gonna waste him. You're also going to create ways to run the ball, but maybe not traditionally. So I think obviously the good thing about the Browns on offense is it's not like a tinkering. It's a down to the studs, and you got to figure out what you're going to do, and whoever that offensive coordinator is going to be, then you can kind of draft accordingly.
So I do want to ask you this because we've talked about this over the years with this Bengals offense and sort of how Zach Taylor runs things. And we've talked about it specifically with like Myles Garrett. The Bengals always sort of just do what they do, right? Is that, and then we see Brian Callahan go to Tennessee. He doesn't even make it 2 years there. Is there any concern about, I guess where pitcher falls in all of that as far as is he going to come in and just sort of do what he does? Is he going to build it around the talent he has? Are you concerned that maybe this could look a little more like what Zach Taylor does in Cincinnati, where he just doesn't make a ton of, game to game adjustments?
Well, I think that's a fair question. My thing would be, first thing I would tell everybody is that no matter what coordinator you bring in, if you don't have players, you're not going to be successful. So when people say he's only successful because he had those players, no, he tinkered it to what he had. He had great skill. He's used Chase Brown out of the backfield. Now, the thing that works for them is that, there's, like I've said to you, there's two different ways, like blitzing, for example. The Bengals use Joe Burrow to beat the blitz. Joe Burrow's a guy that can do that, but it's really easy to block the blitz too. The problem is when you block a blitz, you usually don't get that fourth or fifth guy out. And that's kind of what Zach Taylor does with spreading the field horizontally and vertically, is that he gets 5 out to create these really clear pictures. But the clear pictures have to be seen by the quarterback. And if Browns don't have the quarterback, you can still run all those things. But what ends up happening is that when you have less guys in the routes, the windows get tighter because, if there's an underneath guy, so let's say, Junkins was going to run an arrow route. Well, that flat defender has to kind of squeeze on Junkins and he can't get behind to the curl route. Well, if Junkins has to block, then that flat defender can sink more, right? And kind of get in those lanes. So it kind of muddies the picture when you don't get all guys out. But I would say no. And once again, it comes down to philosophy and how you're going to do things. These guys are all really smart guys. You're not, even McVay and all this stuff. It's the window dressing is how they do stuff. They're all running the same plays. There's not rocket science. They're adding tweaks and motions and shifts, and they're doing all those things. So it comes down to more than anything else. The coach is important, but they got to get some players on offense.
So let's move on to another name that I think has a lot of Browns fans very intrigued over the last couple days, and that is Grant Udinski, the offensive coordinator for Jacksonville. Has been their offensive coordinator for a year. Came from Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota. Of course, you could trace Kevin O'Connell to Sean McVay, the Scheelhaase tree, all of that. And we know how good of a coach Kevin O'Connell has been in his time in Minnesota. Grant Udinski graduated college in, I think it was 2018, Lance. How would you feel about standing there at training camp doing press conferences with somebody who graduated college? And maybe I'm shortchanging him a little bit. Maybe it was like 2016 or something, but it wasn't very long ago. I'll put it that way.
Well, I was wondering about that. Not, maybe us would be one thing, but I was wondering about those players who are in their 30s, right? That'd be interesting for me. But yeah, Udinski's an interesting guy. So, Kevin O'Connell, who I really like, and he's done, like you said, that whole tree of condensed formations, multiple motions, using the receivers to block, constant window dressing, constant. I always say the idea of creating clean windows all the time. That's what they really do with all these motions, movements, shifts. They're creating windows, and they're running, and they're making you look at other stuff, but they're still running the same plays. And I can't tell you how many 49ers film I run this year where they're running power, but they've run it out of 30 different sets. Well, it doesn't matter because it's still power. And for an offense, they're running power, but one guy's doing motion. So just really creative. Now, obviously, coming from the Jags, I'm a big Liam Cohen fan. I thought he's a really good guy. Once again, a guy who likes spread and doing different things. But Udinski's an interesting guy, and I was reading some articles on him today that talked about like when you're interviewed, and there's some guys, I've done that too. When you interview a guy, you're just like, wow, this guy's really sharp. And everything you hear about Udinski is that how sharp he is and how professional he is and what an old soul he is and how he's kind of an old school football guy. And he's kind of, for me, he kind of fits this mold of he's a young guy who bases everything on numbers, but there still seems to be some feel there. There still seems to be like, we got to get, that's the McVay. Everybody talks about McVay's offense, but I always say this, the thing that separates McVay, for me, even to Scheelhaase, and I think McVay is the best offense coordinator because his best guys are going to get it. And you and I talked about it with Cooper Kupp in the Super Bowl. It didn't matter what happened. They were going to get the ball to Cooper Kupp, and he designed 80 different ways to get it to him on that last drive, but he was getting it. And I think that's important, is that even though he's an analytics guy and a numbers guy, he's a guy like based on feel, players over plays. And I think he's, everything you hear about him is how sharp he is. At 30 years old, though, that's a big learning curve when you're the CEO of everything. You better get some experienced coordinators if that's the case.
Yeah, I've seen some clips going around on Twitter of him talking about, some podcast appearances or press conferences. And, I've seen the quotes about him, but it does give me pause. It's not even so much that he's only 30. I mean, that's part of it, but it's that he's only been a coordinator for 1 year. And yeah, I think about Sean McVay. He was hired just before he turned 31, and he was a coordinator in Washington for 3 years before he got hired. Now, that was still a big roll of the dice there. And I wonder a little bit about, and we're going to get to Nate Scheelhaase too, who hasn't been a coordinator at all. I wonder if Grant Udinski, just from his end, might look at this and say, am I better off going back to Jacksonville, being a coordinator for another year, instead of throwing my hat in Cleveland of all places, where who knows, like, look, we've all, obviously they've been pretty stable the last 6 years, but like, we know how this place can get. We know what this place can do to young coaches. So I wonder if from his end, he might look at this and say, maybe I'm better off getting another year or two as a coordinator and waiting for that right job to come along.
Oh, and that's a real thing. If you look at the number of things that have to happen when you're a head coach in terms of installation, and you talk about everything, like you're in charge of everything, hiring a staff and what schemes you're going to run and your weight room program and all. I mean, I can give you a list, and I literally have a list of 100 things that a head coach has to do that don't involve football. And that's what really makes it tough. So when you're a young guy like that, not only are you going to try to like have your influence on whoever you hire as a coordinator, but now all this other stuff is new, right? How do you handle the draft? What influence do you have on the draft? The thing that I would worry about most if the Browns bring in a young guy is what kind of control does he have? Is he really in control, or is he a guy that is going to do what he's told? And that doesn't make it wrong. It's just what kind of guy are they bringing in? And if you bring in a young guy like that, he's going to need a ton of support, not because he can't do it. Like you said, it's not about his age. It's that he's never done it. I would be just as concerned if the guy was my age and has never done that. Because I took a head coaching job at 40 years old, and you're like, man, at the high school level, you can't believe the amount of stuff. You can only imagine at the NFL level what it is. Just the constant barrage of media and what are you doing in the off season and all the responsibilities you have and how do you draft? And, all this, it's so much, it's incredible. So that would worry me more. Not that he can't do it. It's just that, are the Browns in a position to teach somebody that, which tells you he probably wouldn't be in charge, which I don't think is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and he's young enough too. I mean, obviously, you always have to balance this idea of how many opportunities are you going to get for this type of job, but also, again, taking the right job. I think Ben Johnson is an example of a guy who waited for the right job. And now look what he's doing in Chicago, found a quarterback that he liked, all of that stuff. And, I wonder if Grant Udinski is going to look at this and say, I like the experience of getting some head coach interviews, but it might be nice to be a coordinator and kind of handle, you still have to talk to the media every week. You still have to face that criticism of being a play caller, all of that stuff. If he actually would call plays at some point. I think it was Cohen calling the plays there this year. But getting another year or two being one step away from the big chair and kind of getting to observe how it's handled and observe how it's done, because it really is, especially during the season, it's putting out 10 fires a day. And it could be fires from the locker room. It could be from somebody in personnel asking you why you aren't playing this guy over this guy. It could be, you're
endless
at
endless.
home. They're mad that they haven't seen you for 3 days. I mean,
it's endless.
It's literally just putting out fires constantly.
Well, and I will say this, and I believe this at high school, college, and the NFL level, a bad job is your last job. And, that's what you don't want. You don't want a job where it's, if you're an offensive minded guy and you're coming into this Browns situation and you're trying to make a name for yourself, how good will this offense be next year? You have to look at all those things, because if you're going to go to a situation where it's a complete rebuild on one side of the ball and it's not very good, well, you are what your record says you are. So you're the guy in charge, even though this wasn't all Kevin's fault, you're the guy in charge, and that's what ends up happening. So, I'm a big believer in that. From every level of football, if you take a bad job, it'll be your last job. So you have to make sure that doesn't mean individual jobs are bad jobs. What it means is, are you ready for the work that's needed for whatever job you go to? That's really what it comes down to, because all NFL jobs are really good. There's only 32 of them, but what are you willing to put in, and how much power do you have?
Yeah, and I also think people underestimate the idea of, from the end of July until whenever your season's over in January, you're the guy that sits in front of the media Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, Monday. Like, you have to answer for everything, even things that don't, like Myles Garrett gets a speeding ticket. Not your fault. Maybe somebody else in the organization should have to talk about that, but that's not how it works. You got to address that. But
he was one of the first. But you're right, and that was one of the first phone calls that happened. I guarantee you, Kevin got a call at home when that happened, and you're right. Yeah. That has nothing to do with him, and these are grown men. But I guarantee you, he got a call, and what are you going to do about it, and what are the consequences, and how do you go about that? And if we suspend Myles,
how do you explain it? How do you explain it publicly? Right? Kevin never explained anything publicly. That was his tact. Are you going to say what you did? Are you going to And then if you say what you did, and you say the wrong thing, now it's a headline on Pro Football Talk. And it's a hard job.
And if you don't play him, now you're hurting your other teammates. But if he plays, then what if somebody else gets in trouble? You've set a precedent by not punishing this. It's a whole cast of fires that are just endless, and it's really, really, it's a tough job.
So that takes us to, that was our Grant Udinski discussion. I think we both agree, right? Brilliant offensive mind.
Yeah.
It would be a risk to hire a 30-year-old who's been a coordinator for 1 year. But I mean, you could say that with a lot of first-time head coaches. So speaking of, let's move on to Nate Scheelhaase. Now, this guy is a direct descendant of Sean McVay. He has never been a coordinator. This feels a little bit like the Zach Taylor hire when Cincinnati hired Zach Taylor. And the joke going around was anybody who shakes Sean McVay's hand gets a head coaching interview. Zach Taylor was never a coordinator, got that Bengals job, took him to a Super Bowl, but it has been sort of mixed results. He's now the longest tenured AFC North head coach somehow. With Nate Scheelhaase, tell me a little bit about what you've learned about him and why you think he might be on the Browns' radar.
Well, obviously that's the McVay effect, right? That Shanahan, the idea of formations. When you watch, the easiest way to think about it, when you watch the Rams play, it's different than watching everybody else play. When you watch the 49ers play, it's different. And the reason why is because how they're formating, how they're using personnel groups, how they're creating space, what they're doing with motion, what they're doing with shifts, what they're doing with movement as a whole on offense, how they use receivers in the blocking game, how they use big personnel to, just multiple, and I always think it's condensed formation and it's movement. And that's what they're really good at. Constant movement, motion shifts, and whatever it may be. Scheelhaase is a guy that, I heard a great, somebody said, well, what does he do? And McVay said, well, he's the guy who I come up with the plan and he's the painter of the plan. And what that really means is that, first of all, he's literally with McVay all the time. And during the week, right, you have 2 or 3 work days. And during those work days, you're going to get stuff like inside run and blitz pickup and red zone and all the situational stuff that happens at every level of football. Well, in those situational, if it's a 10-minute block, you probably have 12 to 14 to 16 plays scripted. You have them scripted against the defense and what that defense does for the opposing team. And that's what Scheelhaase is doing. So he's taking what McVay wants and he's creating this plan with the scripts and the cards, and he's doing all the really super hard work, which is why that's why you become really, really smart, though, because that's how you learn defense. That's how you learn every position on the field, because you have to know what Scheelhaase has to know what a three technique does, because he has to draw it on the card for that week. He has to know where Miles lines up because he has to put it on the card. So when he says he's painting the picture, I was like, okay, that's good. I remember him at Illinois, really smart kid. I thought he was a really good quarterback then. I think he's a guy, because of McVay, people have this thought, and it'd be different if the idea that he's that actually excites me more than any other position coach, because he's literally with McVay all the time if he's the guy in charge of doing what he does.
Yeah, and I think and I should mention he's been a coordinator at the college level. Has not been a coordinator at the pro level. I think it's interesting, this idea, and this kind of got some traction when the Rams and Jags played earlier this year. This idea of how valuable it is for these coaches to sort of sit here and sort of do some of this stuff the old school way, right? Chart out plays. Josh McDaniel has talked about how, Bill Belichick would make him sit there with a pad, and he'd have to chart everything. And he'd take it to Bill, and Bill would say, no, this is wrong. And he'd have to go back and do it again. And just how much he learned about everything on the offensive side of the ball, and he started on the defensive side, even, like, just everything he learned doing that. And Liam Cohen, same kind of deal, doing that for Sean McVay, like just sort of this old school way of like, you're going to sit down and you're going to chart out these plays and you're going to understand why all of this stuff happens, why that's so important for a young coach.
Well, yeah, and I'll give you an example. My dad was a defensive coordinator his whole life. He was a defensive coordinator at the Division I college level. So he was a high-level coordinator, and I was always an offensive guy. And everything I learned from was Charlie Molnar, and he taught me stuff. And I remember when I was a coordinator, I come in, I'm a young kid, and the same kind of thing at every level. But you come in and you think you know everything, and then all of a sudden you're like, you learn as a coordinator, you learn odd front, even front, where blitzes come from, who's in charge of what gaps, what coverages, how do you look for coverages, how do you understand if it's cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, cover 6, man coverage, zero coverage, where the blitzes come from, what is nickel, what's dime. You learn all that stuff because that's what the defense is going to do against you, and you have to have a response. So we used to do old school cards where we'd have the old template, and you would draw your offensive play, And then you would go, my dad would say, all right, how would a 4-3 line up to that? How would a 4-2-5 line up to that? How would a 3-4 line up to that? What about cover 2, cover 4? That old school mentality, I think, is really important because it helps you learn the game, what everybody does. It's like special teams, right? Knowing what the kickoff team is supposed to do or the punt team. You know, if you're around it enough, these guys at the NFL, but you could coach every position because you've been around it for so long. You know, I've been around football for 40. You just know these positions because that's all you do. And it's important that you do that old school stuff because it helps you for sure, especially in the heat of the battle.
All right. Is there somebody else you really want to talk about? We haven't talked about Aiden Dirty. We haven't talked about Jesse Minter. We haven't talked about Harbaugh we did talk a little bit about Todd Monken last week, but you know, we haven't talked about some of the bigger names, Mike McDaniel. Let's talk a little bit about that. Mike McDaniel. When you think about him as the head coach of this football team, do you like the fit? Does it make sense? Would you do it?
I like the fit as an offense coordinator. I do not like the fit as a head coach, and here's why. I think he's a very progressive young guy who expects. He would be a great coach, in my opinion, with a veteran team, and maybe and offensively they're not going to be a veteran team most likely. Defensively, I think those guys would love them because I feel like he's the kind of guy like you're a pro, you're an adult, go do your job. And sometimes, and he's not really he's not old school. He's not going to be a guy who's in your face. He's not a guy he's a guy who's a brilliant offensive mind. Now, schematically, it worries me a little bit because at his time in Miami, first of all, having Hill and now having Waddle and having A-Chain and all these guys, his offense is built on space, pace, and good weather. And that's not what you get here in Cleveland for most of the season. So, 2029, that might be a great hire. I'm just not sure, first of all, with the dysfunction of the offense right now, and I don't mean in a negative way, it could be literally, there could be anywhere from 8 to 11 new guys on that offense. So it could be really, it could be something else, you Junkins and Fannin, right? That's the only for sure you'd say right now, in my opinion, right? So, it could be a really big turnover. And I'm not sure if he's that type of guy. I know he's brilliant offensively. You worry about those guys and those Florida guys in the AFC North weather. That offense, I've said it before, that offense that he runs has become so weather-based and timing. I'm not sure that's a great fit in Cleveland right now. But if he's just the offensive coordinator, I think he's smart enough to kind of make it work because he is a Shanahan guy and he does like the run game and he would have to adjust. But the weather scares me more than anything else with Michael McDaniel.
Yeah, that's one of those things. It's hard for me to kind of parse because we saw them go to Buffalo and lose a playoff game, but he was also starting Skylar Thompson and they lost that game 34-31, right? They go to Kansas City and lose a playoff game, but I don't know. Did you expect him to go to Kansas City and win that game? So it can be hard to kind of figure some of that stuff out, but I do think, look, and we saw him here in the rain and the cold, and he looked like the most miserable man in the world. And people thought he was going to get fired. And to his credit, he actually did get fired at the end of the year, but people thought he might get fired that week. To his credit, that team actually played pretty well down the stretch. So
yeah, that was the worst team. That was the worst team we saw this year. Yeah, that was the worst. Yeah. They were the worst team we played this year for sure. They were really, really poor. They gave up. They didn't play. That was a bad performance by the Dolphins that day for sure.
Yeah, and then, like I said, to his credit, they actually finished the year kind of strong. So,
yeah,
I think it's easy to get caught up in his weird press conferences and some of the weird stuff he says and how he dresses and all of that. But I do think he's a good coach.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. He's a brilliant offensive mind, and I think some of that stuff is so over. There's such a way, people want coaches to act and want players to act, and you got to kind of, for me, and once again, I learned everything from my dad, but as an older coach, younger coaches aren't going to act like the way you do, right? So you got to kind of adjust. Do they work hard? Do they understand what they're doing? Did they hold themselves accountable? Did they hold their players accountable? Do they have, whatever it is, what he wears and how he do this stuff? I just never understood why that was such a big deal with him, because he's a really smart offensive mind. I like him just like Jim Schwartz. I think Jim Schwartz would do a great job, but I like those guys as coordinators. Sometimes guys are just, I think Mike McDaniel in the box, calm in the box, calling plays would be really scary.
Okay, we're gonna switch gears here real quick before I let you go because I wanna you get to Kevin Stefanski's on the phone. Okay, He's saying I want to talk to Lance. I have a question for Lance. All right, what should I do? Let's say John Harbaugh is going to take the Giants job.
Mm-hmm.
Should I go to Tennessee, Miami, Atlanta, or should I call up Nick Sirianni and see about being Philly's offensive coordinator?
I'm gonna call Philly. I'm gonna call Philly because I think Philly has the offensive line. Those guys are all younger. Besides Lane, they got Barkley's gonna be good for another year. I think I'd go to Philly and have a great year on offense, and that'll really open up some options for me. If not, I'm gonna go to Miami because of the weather and because I can run what I want to run there. So I would. But if I had to pick between all those, I don't know. Bijan Robinson, it would be really good for him in Atlanta. But I'm going to say call the Eagles and take that roster that's really good and be really good on offense and not have to worry about all the nonsense as a head coach for a year.
Right. Go be a coordinator. Again, you talk to the media once a week. You get to just call plays, run your offense.
You get to coach ball again. You
mentioned a good offensive line and a great offensive line coach.
Yep. You get to be a ball coach, man. There's a lot to be said about that. I'm not, some of these guys, when they come out and say, I just want to coach again. And I can always feel that from them when they say that. Cause I'm like, yeah, that's something you miss when you become a head coach. I just want to go and practice and work an individual and go, do all those things. Even as a head coach, you're at every position group. You're checking in with stuff. It's a non-stop thing. So yeah, I'm going to go, if I'm Kevin Stefanski, I'm taking my talents to Philly. I'm getting some cheesesteaks, and I'm coaching a really good offense and making me a really hot commodity next year.
Atlanta is very interesting.
Yeah, that's a tough.
They've got some talent on that offensive side of the ball. It depends kind of what you think about Michael Penix and when he'll be back and all that. But that's an interesting one. They got a
good offensive line too. Another good young offensive line there in Philly and Atlanta.
And a lot of this just depends on where Harbaugh decides to go, if Mike Tomlin decides to keep coaching, or if he goes into TV, all of that stuff. There's still a lot of variables out there, but I think I'm with you. I wouldn't rule out Tennessee just because if you like that young quarterback, maybe you can do something.
Yeah,
there. But
there's still a lot of drama with that.
It has not been the most stable situation.
I'm going in the press box. I am sitting by myself with my call sheet in front of me. I tell everybody, when I was my dad's offensive coordinator and you're in the press box and it's calm up there, there's nothing better than that. There's no mayhem. There's no nonsense. You just get to coach football. It's amazing. So, yeah, that's what I'm doing if I'm Kevin. After 6 years of mayhem and all the stuff he's been through, I'm going to be Philly's offensive coordinator. And anytime somebody asks me something, I'll go, let me go get Coach Sirianni really quick. Because that's the best thing to do. Let me go get my dad real quick. Yeah. And then all of a sudden when I became head coach, I was like, oh, that's me now.
I will say this: we sit right near the visitors' press box in the Browns stadium, not the visitors' coaches booth in the Browns stadium. We hear a lot of yelling and a lot of table pounding coming out of there.
Oh
good,
yeah,
good and bad. But
absolutely, yeah. I've broken some things in the press box before, no doubt about it.
Probably a lot less chaotic than being down on that sideline, though.
Absolutely,
especially with Big Dom down there with his headset on, and
absolutely.
Stay away. Just stay away. All right. That'll do it for this edition of the Orange and Brown Talk podcast. Find us on Instagram, Orange and Brown Talk, Twitter's Orange Brown Talk. Of course, get subscribed on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, check out our YouTube, which is Cleveland Browns on cleveland.com. You heard from Mary Kay and Ashley earlier. That was Lance Reisland. I'm Dan Labbe. Thanks for listening, everybody.